Hello, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me today, I've got Greg Satell, and we're going to talk about his book, Cascades. How do you create a movement that drives transformational change? It's a fascinating book, Greg.
Thanks.
You've been to some interesting places, haven't you? And done some interesting things. I've never said this before. I'd like to sit next to you at a dinner party. So, Greg, where can people find you?
You don't know how much I eat.
What? Where can people find you, Greg?
You can find me at my website, gregsatell.com, and also my blog, digitaltonto.com.
Okay.
And of course, LinkedIn and the regular places.
Yeah. And I know, because I did, when I did the prep for this, I did some research on you, and your Digital Tonto is where you put most of your articles and stuff, and then you put them over to LinkedIn and stuff. So it's definitely a place to go and look.
Yeah, it's funny because back when I started my blog, people didn't name their blogs after themselves. We all made up names. It shows you how old that blog is, right?
Yeah, there's stacks on it, and it reflects you and your thoughts. Getting into you in the book, and as I said, I found it fascinating because you've been in some interesting places. Ukraine, for example, which is obviously in the news, and what you saw was how a movement started, and it went. And what you did was that you were there, and you saw how it built. So first and foremost, you talk about in the book the fact that we've shifted from hierarchies to networks. So talk us through that.
Well, look, there's always been both hierarchies and networks. And we still have hierarchies, and we need hierarchies. We need leaders to set directions. And there's been various attempts to do away with leadership structures. Holacracy was one that had its day in its sun, maybe, 6-7 years ago. And I actually met with the founder of that. And to be honest, it didn't make much sense to me then that you could just do away with leaders. But the difference is the way things connect today. Hierarchies have become slow, and the world has become fast. So we need to think a whole lot more about networks.
Yeah.
And leaders need to shape networks and ecosystems. And that's pretty much the jobs. The function of a leader is no longer merely to plan and direct action, but to inspire and empower belief in a common project. That's really the shift.
I was talking to I did a interview this week with somebody who used to be in the leadership team at Microsoft, and she said that one of the things I said that I had a long conversation with her offline about working with Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, and she said, because I said what it looks like from the outside in is that in effect that he's pushed and empowered the people below him to do the stuff, and then that cascades down through the organization. And she said it's just like that. She said what he does when you meet him is ask loads of questions, but you're not there to report to him. You're there in effect to do the job. You see what I mean? There's a difference in that, in the way that's got a hierarchy. Whereas I've worked for very command and control organizations where there's comfort in hierarchy.
McChrystal wrote about that in Team of Teams, how it kind of shifted. It used to be that the information would flow up and the leadership would make a decision, and then that decision would flow down. But he said it's even if it's the right decision, the time it takes, by the time it travels up and down, it becomes the wrong decision. And that's what really struck me about the events in Kyiv in 2004, because we have this idea of how the world works. And that was a moment for me that the universe just opened up itself for a brief moment and revealed itself. And I realized that the world didn't work the way that I thought it did. It worked in some different way, that anybody who with any sort of conventional power was all of a sudden incapable of shaping events. And there was just this mysterious force that no one could describe, but nobody could deny, that was moving events along. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, and I hope I was successful, was make clear I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
I wasn't some clever guy what struck me is how little I understood. And I was running a major news organization. I was talking to reporters in the newsroom every day. I was talking to other business leaders. I was talking to political leaders. If anybody should have understood what was going on, it was me. But I didn't, and nobody I knew really understood it either. And it was a real struggle to figure out what happened. It took me 15 years to write Cascades. And a few years after I was part of those events in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 and 5, I was in Silicon Valley doing a publishing course at Stanford. And everybody was talking about social networks because, of course, now it was 2006 and Facebook was becoming a thing. And we had a very large digital business. So I thought, well, this is something I should really learn about. And I started researching network science. And what I found was a nearly perfect mathematical explanation for almost everything that happened during the Orange Revolution. And I thought, wow, and that's what got me hooked. And then I eventually met my friend Serja, who I write about quite a bit in the book, who led the movement that overthrew Milosevic, and then trained activists in the Georgian Republic and in Ukraine. Yep. And built this repeatable model for overthrowing a country. And yes, we became friends. And what I realized was this would be a very good model. And being a business leader myself and having had the opportunity to run a number of business transformations, both in the company I was running, but also as an external consultant in companies that were going through stress, let's call it, turnaround situations. I realized that this would be an excellent model to run transformation in an organization. And that's what led to Cascades, is applying those principles of social and political movements to organizational change. Yeah. And now we're going through a new step, and we're launching something next month called Change OS, which will be a full operating system for change.
Okay, wow, that sounds impressive. One of the things that what really comes out to me about the book is the fact that you start talking about these things, and you're very honest to say that in Kiev you didn't know what was happening. The first thing that happened was your partner at the time walked in and said, "I'm going to the demonstration." You said, "What demonstration?" And then all these things happened where people were taking food to the demonstrators and stuff. No one ever organized it. It just happened. And
there was a bit more organization than I realized at the time.
Yeah, but there was that was the whole start of that movement. So, what is a movement, and how do you create one?
Well, I think it's important to make the distinction between a movement and a moment.
Okay,
we've seen, especially over the last 10 years or so, a number of moments where people come out into the streets, they make a lot of noise, nothing really happens, and they go home.
Yeah.
That's a moment
Yeah.
where there's an event, and I talk about the science behind this in the book about threshold models of collective behavior, Mark Granovetter's work, Duncan Watts, and so on and so forth. But that's a moment. There's an event that that lowers thresholds of resistance to collective behavior, and you see a lot of action that doesn't sustain itself. A movement is different. A movement is based on networks of empowerment. And as I mentioned if you look at the reviews on Amazon, they say the book is repetitive, some of them, which is by design, of course. One thing I repeat over and over again in the book is that movements are really about small groups, loosely connected, but united by a shared purpose. And as leaders, if we want to lead change, we need to help those groups to connect and inspire them with a sense of shared purpose.
So why is it that movements, how do they start and why do they fail?
There are a number of reasons why. I think I mentioned in the book that it's much like Tolstoy said about families. All happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But that's an important one, to think that just because a bunch of people go out in the streets, that's a success. That's not a success. In fact, marches are a very problematic tactic. The first thing is you need to have a real vision of tomorrow. You can't just have grievances.
Yep.
You need to be able to articulate.
You talk in the book about what you call there's a 4-step plan, and the first step is define, which is the vision of tomorrow.
Right. Well, there's a number of things you need to define. You need to define the vision of tomorrow, going back beyond grievance. You need to define a keystone change, which has a practical and tangible goal. It involves multiple stakeholders, and it leads to greater change. You need to be explicit about your values. Really super important. And we've added a fourth one in Change OS, which we call a resistance inventory.
Right.
Which is really important, because that's really why movements fail, because they fail to overcome resistance. They fail to anticipate and overcome resistance. And there's a number of places resistance comes from. There are perverse incentives. There's change fatigue, which is a big issue right now. There
vested
is
interest.
Excuse me?
Vested interest.
Switching costs is what we call that. Switching costs. There's lack of trust. There is just simply irrational resistance, because human beings make attachments to people, ideas, and things. And when those attachments are threatened, we tend to react in a bad way. And we all do this. Anybody who's ever been married knows this. Right? Anytime you set out to make a significant impact, you're going to find that there's some people who aren't going to like it, and they're going to work to undermine what you're trying to achieve in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And then there's also about surviving victory. So very, very often, and we see this all the time in organizational transformations, they think once they get that initial victory, that their project gets budgeted, or they get executive sponsorship, or their first partner, or whatever it is, they think it's going to get easier after that. It's going to all be downhill once they reach that peak. But actually the opposite happens. It gets much harder, and they're not prepared for it. And that's why they fail to survive victory. And the reason that happens is because your most active opposition is usually not a vocal opposition.
Yes.
I mean, everybody's had this experience where you're in a meeting and it's sort of moving slowly towards a consensus. And when you're coming to the end and you're moving towards next steps, all of a sudden somebody who hadn't said a word the entire time throws a hissy fit in the middle of the conference room and completely discredits themselves. And there's a reason why that happens, because they're just sitting there silently waiting for it to fail. And when they see it going forward, they feel that they have to act.
Yeah.
So you need to anticipate that. And if you look at and this is one of the reasons why I think it's helpful to look at social and political movements for transformational change, because the documentation's so much better. We almost never hear when it's we only hear about transformation, organizational transformations when they're successful. We hardly ever hear about the failures.
No, because we've been under the carpet.
Exactly. And even when we do hear about them, it's when a business school professor or consultant interviews half a dozen people and writes a case study, which can be helpful, but it's quite limited. Where social and political movements, we often have thousands of firsthand accounts. And invariably, if you think about any of the big political revolutions, whether it's Gandhi or civil rights or LGBTQ and same-sex marriage or whatever it is, they win not when people are convinced necessarily, not because they convince people or persuade people, but when the opposition discredits themselves. Gandhi and the Salt March.
Yep.
Civil rights, if you think about Birmingham, where Martin Luther King, he knew that Bull Connor wouldn't be able to resist, that Bull Connor wanted to show the world who he was. And Martin Luther King wanted to let him. So that is, and of course, LGBTQ and same-sex marriage in the United States and Proposition 8, which was seen as so reactive. So it's learning a big part of making change succeed is learning to sit down and say beforehand, where's the resistance going to come from? How are they going to attack us? And how can we appeal to shared values to overcome that resistance?
And so you go through the process of defining and I love that. And I remember reading when you said about surviving victory, because it is so true. And then we only have to look back at some of the big revolutions that have taken place, that when you win, actually it's so hard. I mean, you look at Ukraine. I mean, they've still
well, the Orange Revolution, we failed to survive victory.
Yeah.
And for the usual reasons, because you can never base your transformation on any particular technology or person or policy. It always needs to be based on shared values. And one of my favorite examples of that, the Orange Revolution, of course, is a great example of that, because we did fail. We thought we succeeded, but it turned out, we found out later, we didn't, because it was based on one person who we wanted to be president. And once he failed, the movement failed with him. And that's what they got right in 2013 and 14 with Euromaidan. Again, shared values, European values. And even today in Ukraine, Zelensky is constantly talking about values. And it's very, very real. But also in the book, I talk about the same thing at IBM in the 90s, where Lou Gerstner, not only did he say, no, we're going to shift We're going to shift our values from our proprietary stack of products to the customer's stack of business processes. But here's the important, and one thing we talk about a lot with our work on organizations: values always incur costs and constraints. If you're not willing to incur costs and constraints, it's not a value, it's just a platitude. If you're not willing, and we ask people and they say they value the customer, they value excellence, they value quality, what does it cost you? Because if you can't say what it costs you, it's not really a value. And Gerstner, and I've interviewed dozens of executives from that period, and they all point to the same thing. It was because he was willing to forgo revenue on every sale. That's the only reason people believed it, and that's the only reason IBM's still in business.
It's a fantastic story, Greg. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book. It's a fascinating read because it's not your traditional business book. It's, you talk about your experiences and your contacts, and there's a couple of laughs in there as well. It's not all just politics, like some of the barrel where people could come and hit the picture of
the barrel prank with Otpor in Serbia.
Yeah, in Serbia, where basically so as you said, demonstrations are interesting, but actually demonstrations for quite often, if you do a demonstration, it actually puts people off. Whereas this was this prank where they put the picture of the person they didn't like on this barrel, and you could
it was Milosevic, right?
Yeah, and you could basically hit the barrel, and people just did it, and the police didn't know what to do because it wasn't illegal to hit a barrel with a stick.
And they weren't there, so there was no one to arrest.
And there was no one to arrest.
They were down the street.
It's just so it was just a perfect, prank and a perfect way to protest. And it was just a tactic amongst that, but it was great fun.
Well, besides that, it invited people in, and that's the most important thing about any transformation. You need to look for converts, not heretics.
Yeah. Greg, thank you so much for coming on. Remind people where they can get hold of you.
At gregsatell.com, at digitaltonto.com, and of course you can buy Cascades wherever books are sold.
You can get it on Amazon, or worldwide, Brilliant. Thank you so much for today, Greg. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And it's been nice.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And lovely meeting you as well.
Thanks.